Hello, good evening, and welcome to episode 26 of Montague Island Books. Now, really excited about today's author guest, as they write crime, and they also write about life on the canal, which is another interest of mine. So first of all, before we meet our guest, I'll just read you a bit of his bio that I got from his website. So he began writing the first book in the Jumping Jack Flash series of crime thrillers. That was Canal Pushers, after completing a 25-year career at the BBC. Having a debut novel published at the grand old age of 57 is reasonably rare. But as Henry David Thoreau said, how vain it is to sit down and write when you've not stood up to live. That's great saying that. His fiction writing is the latest chapter in a long and happy life, which began in Gibraltar, where he was born, with son of a physical training instructor in the British Army. He grew up in army garrison towns around the UK, as well as overseas bases in Germany and Hong Kong, but he got fed up of joining new schools and being forced to make new friends every 2 years, so he gained entry to the Duke of York's Royal Military School at Dover, and he boarded there until the age of 18. He narrowly escaped a career in the army or the law, and went on to study journalism at Portsmouth and worked as a local newspaper reporter on his home weekly, the Poole and Dorset Herald. He's always been a voracious reader, and he indulged himself by taking 3 years away from journalism to gain a first-class BA honours in combined studies, English and American literature with classics. Wow, that's very good, at the University of Manchester. He then returned to reporting for the Bath Evening Chronicle before joining the BBC as a reporter-producer on Points West, the regional news programme in Bristol. And his time in Bath inspired to set River Rats, his second book in the city. He then went on to become head of BBC South in Southampton, controller of BBC English regions in Birmingham, and finally editorial director in overall charge of the BBC's largest ever capital project, the redevelopment of BBC Broadcasting House in London. What a career. After leaving the BBC, he worked as a media consultant in Dubai and Malaysia, and he's now happily writing fiction from his home in rural Worcestershire, where his study distracts him with a spectacular view of the Malvern Hills. The day begins for him with a walk with his 3 dogs, including Eddie, a border terrier, who also featured prominently in the books. And then it's back to the keyboard with occasional excursions to check on our rare breed pigs, Oxford Sandy and Blacks, or a trip to the pub with my wife Helen in a 1964 Triumph Spitfire. Nice. He says holidays, of course, are occasionally spent on canals in hired narrowboats with our friends, but to date, note, there have been no real-life murders. And just about 3 weeks ago, he released his 3rd book, Oxford Blues, and I'm very pleased to welcome, our guest on today. So a very good evening, Andy Griffee.
Evening, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Lovely to have you, and we've got so much packed in there, a lot to talk about, but perhaps you can first of all just start by telling us a little about the books that I mentioned.
Yeah, I'd love to. Well, I suppose, as you say, the mystery series is set on canals, and it follows the fortunes of a divorced and unemployed journalist. He's not me, but he's called Jack Johnson, and Jack lives on a 64-foot canal narrowboat, which is called Jumping Jack Flash. And the beauty of this is that it means that Jack can move all around the country. He's not stuck in one place. So my first book, this one, which is called Canal Pushers, is set in the Midlands, where I live. I live in Worcestershire, so it's on the Worcester and Birmingham Canal and the Stratford Canal. And it involves a journey which Jack takes from Stratford-on-Avon up to Birmingham and then down to Worcester in the course of the book. The second book, River Rats, that's River Rats there, that's set in Bath on the River Avon and the Kennet and Avon Canal. And then the third book, which came out only about 3 weeks ago. It's called Oxford Blues, and unsurprisingly, that's set in Oxford, but it's based on the River Isis, which is what the River Thames is called when it goes through Oxford. So Jack Johnson, who lives on this boat, is friends with a younger army widow who is called Nina Wilde, and he would very much like to be more than just friends with Nina, but Nina is still grieving for her husband, who was killed in Afghanistan, working, serving with the British Army. But nevertheless, the two of them work together, move around the country and solve various waterways-based crime mysteries. The books are all inspired by real events. So, for example, the idea for one plot line in Canal Pushers, the first book, came from, there's been a lot of newspaper speculation about the bodies of young men who are found dead in the deep locks of the inner city canals in Manchester. And there's a lot of speculation that perhaps there's a serial killer, preying on young men who are drunk or drugged, walking next to the canals at night. And so that gave me the idea for one plot line in the first book, but I transferred the action from Manchester to the Midlands. And in my latest book, Oxford Blues, that's inspired by this county lines activity. Is where big criminal gangs from London or Birmingham, from the big cities, they move into the smaller towns and cities in the country, and they use kids sometimes as young as 11 or 12 for drug dealing and prostitution. And Oxford in particular has had a problem with that. So you can see why I call these books Canal Noir. Forget about Scandi Noir and Tartan Noir. Canal Noir is the new genre.
I like that.
There was a critic writing about them recently who called them Tiller thrillers, which I thought was quite good as well. But anyway, it's not just about crime and boating. It's also, I hope people will enjoy some of the humor in them. There's deliberately some humor in them. And of course, there's this underlying romance, the will they, won't they romance between Jack and Nina. And then, as you said in your kind introduction, there's also a little border terrier dog called Eddie, who is adopted by Jack and lives on the boat with him. And he came from a homeless young man who comes to an abrupt and watery end in the first book in Canal Pushers. So it's Eddie, Jack and Nina and their narrowboat, Jumping Jack Flash, and the crime mystery adventures that they have around the country. So that's the idea behind the series.
Wonderful. And I love, as you were saying, the sort of real life events in another place, but they're related to real life events, because I know it's been in the news. It was just last week or so about the county lines, and them using the canals, and it's happening now, kind of thing. So it was in the news not long ago. So that's interesting. So I believe you're working. You just released a third book, and I believe so you're working on a fourth book, I believe, in the series.
Yeah, I mean, over the last 3 years, I've tried to bring out one book a year for the series, and so I'm ahead of myself for next year. I've just finished the first draft of book 4, but the only people to read it so far have been my wife Helen and my father, who's a big crime book reader, and they both really enjoyed it. It's slightly different in that instead of being set on the waterways of the UK, it's set on the canals of Amsterdam. Jack and Nina go on holiday there, but of course they can't just have an ordinary boring holiday. They get caught up in all kinds of international politics and even some espionage. So it's slightly different. It's a bit more of an international thriller feel to it, but I'm really pleased with it. And hopefully when orphans get to see it, my publishers, they'll enjoy it too.
Great. Sounds wonderful. So how can people contact you? Social media, websites, things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm there on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn. And I have a website, andygriffee.co.uk, with all my contact details on. And there's bits of information about me on the website. And I try to keep people informed about where I am with writing and when the next books are out, but also just what books I'm reading as well, because I think you can't be any kind of decent writer unless you read a hell of a lot as well.
Yeah.
So I use the website to tell people what I'm reading and what I think about the latest book that I've read. And of course, you can actually go through to the website and buy the books as well at a click of a button. So, just the usual stuff on social media and the website.
Brilliant. And as regard, what formats are the books available in? Are they, can you get audiobook, or are they paper?
Yeah, no. So at the moment, they're coming out in the first instance in hardback, and I'm told that's because libraries, and they've been particularly popular in libraries, prefer to get hardbacks because they can take a bit more wear and tear. Yeah. And then as well as coming out in hardback, they come out in ebook form, so they're available for Kindle via Amazon and so on. And then Canal Pushers is also now out as a paperback, and I'm hoping that the publishers will add to the hardback and the ebook versions of Oxford Blues and River Rats with paperbacks of those two books probably next spring. Right. We haven't got into audiobooks yet, but I know we're kind of looking at that.
Yeah, because I know a lot of people always sort of ask, "Oh, when's the audiobook coming out?" So
yeah, I mean, they are, it's proving to be an incredibly popular format, isn't it? And I think it's not quite there yet in terms of matching sales of Kindle or even hardback, but it's the fastest rising new format that there is out there. So yeah, we've got to find a way of doing that as well.
Definitely, that's great. And so what was it that got you interested in canals? I know you sort of said you've been on a couple of holidays. Was it that started it off, or was?
Well, I know lots of people think of canals as gentle and bucolic and gorgeous weather, and you just like moor up at the bottom of a pub and have a few pints, and everything is lovely, and the spots and geese are there. But actually, I think that's true, but I think there's a flip side to that, and I think canals can be quite threatening and quite dangerous places, especially around the fringes of the bigger cities.
Yeah,
and they are dangerous places, but they can feel like that as well. And also there's this kind of myth that everybody gets on with each other on canal. It's like rubbish, like kind of people who own narrowboats hate people who hire narrowboats.
Yeah.
All narrowboat owners or hire boat owners hate anglers, and anglers hate boat owners. People who ride their bikes along the towpath don't particularly like anglers, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Dog walkers don't like cyclists coming up fast behind them, and then cyclists don't like the dog walkers when their lead gets stretched out in front. There's actually quite a lot of tension on canals, and I think any setting where there's a bit of a threatening atmosphere and there's lots of tension going on is quite a good backdrop for crime novels, really.
Especially when, from personal experience, when you have you're dealing with some like really dangerous locks. Like there was one near where we used to moor, which was one of the deepest locks, and it was scary when you used to go through. But you'll get people who would come who didn't know what they were doing, and they were like,
yeah. Well, one of the main, I'm sure if you've had a boat of your own for a while, or your father did, and you'll know that when you're in a lock, the most dangerous thing that can happen is that you can allow your boat to drift backwards and then get stuck on what's called the sill. And then as the water level goes down, the whole of this 18-ton boat begins to tip, and then water floods in. And without giving too much away, it's called a silling when that happens. And there have been people dying in Worcester when that's happened. And the end of Canal Pushers, something not dissimilar to that takes place.
Yeah. Great. And when people rob the windlasses or the it used to be the Swinbridge keys as well, that's another issue of mayhem on the canal.
If you let go of it when it's spinning around, that can
can rip your arm off it, can't it?
Or if it hits you in the head, you're gonna know about it.
Yeah, but it brings back many memories. So we will now go on to have a look. We'll start packing your case ready for your trip to Montague Island, which for those who may be listening or watching for the first time, Montague Island is a fictional island that was created by Mike Craven. in one of his books. And that, when I was sort of thinking of an idea of something along the lines of Desert Island Disc for books, I just read one of Mike's books, and the island came up quite a bit, and that's where it all came from. So it's a fictional island off the coast of Cumbria, and when anyone lands on the island, there is a Kindle waiting for them, a fictionary Kindle, with all of the Mike Craven books on the, as well as the books that you're taking with you. So first of all, what is your what's your first book that you're going to be taking with you, Andy?
Okay, before I tell you, I'm just going to say how relieved I am that Mike Craven's books are already there, because I'm a huge fan of the Washington Poe series. I mean, just great characters, and he has a dog as well called Edgar, who's a Springer Spaniel, and I've got a Springer Spaniel as well as Eddie the Border Terrier. But
just a question, just before we get on to the first book. I know Mike always says about people writing in, checking that the dog's okay because he's not been home to feed it. Have you been able to avoid those kind of issues?
Yeah, I suppose so, because I've got 3 dogs, and I've had dogs. I mean, I took a dog to university with me, so I've always loved dogs and had dogs. So it's such a part. They are such a part of my routine. I'm automatically thinking, oh, has he had a walk? Has he had his dinner? Has he had some water recently, and that kind of thing. But you're absolutely right. And I heard Ian Rankin recently talking, because after how many odd books, 24, 25 books, he's suddenly given Inspector Rebus a dog. I don't know whether you knew this. And he was moaning about this because he said, you know, every now and then his wife, who just reads each chapter as it comes off the printer, has to kind of tap him on the shoulder and say, "Oi, you haven't walked the dog for 3 chapters. You haven't given the dog any water for 4 chapters." And he says, you know, it's just messing with his head that he has to worry about the dog now.
Yeah, I can imagine, but yeah, I know Mike quite often tells stories about his, about
Edgar.
About Edgar. But there we go. Anyway, sorry, back to it. So,
no, sure.
Your first book choice.
So, looking back at the 7 I've chosen, there are kind of quite a few classics there. So I thought I'd start off with one that maybe is a bit less well known, and it's called Complicity by Ian Banks. He's a Scottish writer, late Scottish writer, and he's probably more famous for The Wasp Factory or The Crow Road. And that The Crow Road was made into quite a famous series by BBC Scotland. But he also wrote sci-fi under the name Ian M. Banks. Really talented writer, I think. But this is probably one of his less well-known books, but it's one of the most dog-eared paperbacks on my bookshelves. In fact, when I went to get it down for this chat, I suddenly realized that I've got 2 of them. I don't know how I've ended up with 2 of them. Anyway, it shows how much I like it.
Yeah.
Anyway, I kind of reread this book every couple of years, and the chapters alternate between a troubled newspaper reporter's first-person narrative and a second-person account of this serial killer's activities in and around Edinburgh. And I suppose, as a journalist for 30 years, I'm immediately drawn to a journalist as the hero of the book, just as a journalist as the hero of my books. Right. But anyway, there's this whole series of bizarre and quite sadistic murders that are acted out on a whole series of right-wing capitalists. And there's some kind of connection between the people that are being killed and an article that this journalist wrote. And in one, I mean, it really is probably, if this was a film, it would definitely be 18 plus, because, in one of the murders, this arms dealing MP is tied to a chicken wire gate, and he has his artery slashed. After he's made to watch his much loved foxhounds being shot in front of him. So that gives you, I suppose, an idea of it. But anyway, the method of killing sort of matches the immoral activities of the victims in a pretty gruesome way. And it's just kind of really compelling narrative. It really drives forward. And I suppose as a former journalist, I love the focus on the journalism, but there's extreme nihilism in it. And it doesn't let up until way past the end. So lots of surprises and Complicity. It's just kind of one of those books that lingers long in the memory. And although it's not as famous as the Wasp Factory and the Crow Road, I think it's well worth, if you're a crime aficionado, if you like crime fiction, I think it's well worth seeking out.
Definitely, yeah, that sounds great. And it's that good you bought 2 of them?
Yeah, I don't know how. Oh, well, one is £3 from a second-hand bookshop, so that's not too bad. And one I obviously bought new, so I probably thought I'd lost the first one and saw the second one in a second-hand bookshop.
Oh, great! So that's a good book to start with. So, what is your second book going to be, Andy?
Okay, well, the second book is this one, and this is called Human Voices by Penelope Fitzgerald. And it's very different to the first one I talked about. It's quite concise. It's very witty, but I don't know if you can see the cover there. That's BBC Broadcasting House.
Oh, yeah.
In London. So it just, as somebody who worked for the BBC for 25 years, it captures beautifully some of the Byzantine managerial madness of working for the BBC and the eccentric characters that you come across.
Imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just captures the oddity of the place. You can imagine, there are 25,000 people in the BBC, but they're all, they're quite lively, forceful characters. Especially the journalists and the presenters. And at one stage, I had a job at the BBC, which meant I was managing about 3,000 journalists, presenters, and so you can imagine what kind of fun that is. And then my final job at the BBC, which you touched on, I was in charge of the largest ever capital project, which was to close down about 10 BBC buildings all around London and move about 6,000 people into a big extension of Broadcasting House. So I really grew to love, I worked in this place for 5 years and I really grew to love it. It's a kind of magnificent Art Deco listed building in Portland Place. And this novel pays homage to it. And it describes it, if you look at it from the outside, it is a bit like a big ocean liner. It's like a ship. And there's this wonderful description in it, which says, the gossip of the 7 decks increased the resemblance of the great building to a liner, which the designers had always intended. Broadcasting House stood headed on a fixed course south, with the best engineers in the world and a crew varying between the intensely respectable and the barely sane. It looks ready to scorn any disaster of less than Titanic scale. Penelope Fitzgerald, she worked at the BBC as a features producer at the end of 1940, so just after the war broke out, and that's when this book is set. And I honestly think it could only have been written by someone who'd had direct experience of the BBC's oddities, but also its essential values, its kind of creativity and its independence, and it's also very, very funny. So strongly recommended. Human Voices by
again, a book that you can connect with very much. So going back to what we were saying in your sort of intro and your bio about all the work you've done, and you were saying about the BBC Centre in London, when you're writing your autobiography,
I think I'll stick to fiction. Mainly because I couldn't afford the legal fees.
Yeah, probably safer, but
I mean, there is a value in memoirs, but I think you need to be a person of really huge achievement to justify a memoir, and I'd rather just kind of draw on my experience for fiction than go down that road. I think
because you know who the fictional characters are.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
there are some of my fictional characters, that are drawn from life, shall we say.
Yeah, good point. So again, a great choice of book. So what's your third book going to be?
Okay, well, so this is a classic, really, a modern classic. This is Ernest Hemingway, The Old Man and the Sea. And it's the story of a Cuban fisherman called Santiago, who's fishing in the Gulf Stream. And when the book starts, he's had an unlucky streak. He hasn't caught a fish for 84 days. And then on the 85th day, he hooks into a giant marlin, a huge marlin, which tows his rowing boat right far out to sea, and it takes him 3 days of battling this marlin, but eventually he pulls it alongside the boat and begins the long voyage home. And then during that long voyage home, he loses the marlin to sharks who eat it off the side of the boat. I mean, it's a short book, it's a novella, and it was first published in 1952. But it was really the last book he wrote, but it won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1954. And I've always been drawn to Hemingway. Again, it's the journalism. He was a journalist working for newspapers in America, big city newspapers in America. And he was somebody who, I mean, as a journalist, you're taught to write short, sharp, snappy sentences, you know, very direct prose. And he does that in his fiction, and yet somehow he elevates the prose of the journalist into art, like nobody else does. I mean, I think his short stories and this are more successful, frankly, than his longer novels, possibly with the exception of The Sun Also Rises. And I think it's the short format that suits his prose so particularly well. And this is about kind of one man's epic struggle. And it seems to be an allegory of the enormous struggles about, you know, which we all face in life, and how you need tenacity and pride and self-respect to kind of seek to get through them. And I suppose I'm a bit of a stoic as well. And all through my life, when I've kind of been in a kind of particularly difficult situation, I remembered a phrase from Virgil, who I studied when I was at university, and it's "Haec olim meminisse juvabit," which translates as "one day it will be pleasant to remember even this." Okay, and I just find that very useful. You know, when you're stuck in long, tedious meetings at the BBC with the unions or whatever, you know, one day, you know, this won't matter anymore, even though it kind of feels like it really matters hugely at the time. And it just seems to say that there's nothing so bad that you experience that in the end, the passage of time won't make it seem better. So I love the kind of underlying message in this book. And this is actually the copy of the book which I bought for £4.50. The price is still in there in a second-hand bookshop in Manchester when I was at uni there, and it's actually dated 1955, so it's actually only 1 year after Hemingway won the Nobel Prize for it. And I don't know if you can see, Joe, but it has these amazingly beautiful kind of lino cut pictures in the book.
It is nice when you get pictures in a book. You know, details.
They're beautiful miniature works of art. You could almost, you know, it'd be a crime, but you could frame these. And they're actually by two different artists. The publishers commissioned two artists to see what they could do with the story, and then they couldn't decide between them, so they included pictures from both artists in the book. So it's quite a precious book on my bookshelf, and it's definitely one of the ones that, you know, I think you would go back to time and time again, although I don't imagine that there are many marlins or sharks off Montague Island.
No, don't think so. No, not really. Not really the best sort of environment for them. But that is one of those books where I've always said I must read that book, and I never have. So I need to get it to the top of the list and read it, because I've heard a lot of good things about it. Just while we were talking about sort of pictures and looking at the book cover and what have you, just going back to your own books, do you sort of design your own covers and your own titles?
No. There's a great publisher at Orphans, designer at Orphans, who comes up with the design of the book covers.
Just all the books up a bit higher, Andy, and then
so this one, the latest one, this is the view across the River Isis, and these are the University College clubhouses, the rowing clubhouses, which feature in the book. So basically they've taken a picture and then they've made it a lot more dark and moody, and then they also try to make the books consistent as a series, which is an art in itself.
Definitely.
And so Orphans, they show me their final selection and make sure that I'm happy with it, and they're really kind of collegiate in that respect. But that's the thing about publishers. You know, they have the range of skills there that you need across the board, whether it's editing, design, and all the rest of it. So, but the other thing I should point out as you're talking about that is each of my books also has a map at the front.
You can't beat a good map.
So I don't know if you can see the map there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So to the canal.
Yeah. So this is the river in Oxford where the book is set, with all of the, you know, the bridges and the pubs and all of the kind of stuff that's in the book. And I try to make the books as realistic as possible in terms of the setting. And there's a guy called Michael Pearson who produces these things. They're called the Pearson and Son Limited Canal Companions.
Oh yeah.
And if you're out on an hourboat, you know, these are wonderful kind of guidebooks that tell you, you know, each stretch of the canal, you know, where the lock is. And
very handy that, isn't it? Yeah.
So Michael Pearson is very, very kind to me, and every time I've got a book coming up, I get in touch with him, and he produces a bespoke map for books of exactly what the setting is.
Wonderful.
And in fact, he's just brought out 2 of these new guidebooks, new editions of these, and he's paid me the ultimate compliment of referring in his guidebooks to places which I have used in my stories. So he sort of said, there's a murder here in Andy Griffee's book. So that's really nice. I think it's nice for people to be able to think that whether they're in a boat or just walking the dog, they can recreate the setting of where the book is based.
And it gives a new dimension to the book as well, doesn't it? Yeah. You know, when it's real places. So that's great. Good sort of insight on that. So we're now at book number 4. So what's your 4th one going to be?
So 4 is quite famous, probably his finest novel, The Great Gatsby. By F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
One of the great American novels. And it's the story of Jay Gatsby, who's newly wealthy. And he's obsessed with winning back the love of Daisy Buchanan for a second time, having had an affair with her when he was a young soldier and then lost her. And it's set in the time of Prohibition and the Jazz Age. Yeah. And he's famous. He's very rich, and nobody quite knows how he's so rich. But he's suddenly very rich. And there's a hint of the underworld in the background. But he has these lavish parties, and they take place in his mansion, which is directly across the bay from her house. And he holds these parties in the hope of winning her back. And it's written in the first person by a guy called Nick Carraway, who is Daisy's cousin, and who happens to rent a small house on the island next to Gatsby's home. And it's all about class divisions. It's all about the difference between new money and old money, or those with money and those with no money, or those with money and those who kind of just care too much. And the plot isn't hugely remarkable, but I think for me it's the language in this novel which is so amazing. You can kind of open it at almost every page and you can find beautiful poetic writing that's still powerful and very, very descriptive. You know, there's one famous phrase in it: Daisy's voice is full of money, and you know it kind of exactly. You know, it's really short, sharp sentence, but you know exactly what it's saying.
Exactly what it means. Yeah.
It's the inventive phrases like this and the kind of lyrical language, which I think makes the novel great. And it's you know, as I said, it's a very visual book, which is probably why it's been turned into so many films over the years. And lots of people think they know it because they've seen the films, but it's not a huge book, and yet it is so powerful, and you know, you remember it long after you finished it. And it's also, you know, from my point of view, it's a crime novel. There's quite a body count by the end of the book. There, you know, there's a woman that's been mown down in a car, and then there's a guy that's been shot, and then there's a guy who shoots himself. You know, so it is a crime novel as well, but ultimately, I think it's a novel about American optimism and progress and hope, in spite of, you know, the American dream, as it were. You know, in spite of the sleazy mess that human beings get themselves into. So I just think it's a small book, but it's a great book, and it'd always be in my top 7, I think.
Yeah, and as you say, the issues the issues that you were talking about there from in the book, you can still relate to all them today. So it's one of those books that doesn't age, really, does it? So
no, they're universal themes, and they're still as relevant now as they were then.
Yeah, that's great. So that's book number 4. So what have we got for number 5?
Okay, well, this is a bit of a doorstep of a book. This is I studied this book for my O-levels, so you'd think it would put me off. And it's Bleak House by Charles Dickens. And rather than put me off, it's actually remained one of my favorite books for life. And it's over 800 pages. But in a way, it's a book that is very hard to pigeonhole. First and foremost, again, it's a good murder mystery story. There's a lawyer called Tulkinghorn who's shot through the heart. And also a detective called Inspector Bucket appears. And I think it's one of the first appearances of a detective in English fiction.
Right.
So kind of really interesting from that point of view. But it's also a comic novel. It's a social commentary. It's a satire, mainly about the British legal system. It's a romance. There are several romances in it, and it's a melodrama. So it's kind of everything.
Yeah.
And what I find really fascinating about this is that when it was first published in, I think it's 1850s, 1852, it was published in 20 episodes. So Dickens actually needed to construct each episode so that people wanted to actually go out and buy the next one to continue to follow the whole story.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's what crime writers do now. They kind of try to finish each chapter with a cliffhanger or some kind of revelation that encourages the reader to carry on turning the page.
Yeah.
And Dickens was doing it literally. He was publishing it episode by episode in that way, which he was juggling 60 different characters, more than 60 different characters in this book, masses and masses of subplots and intricate subplots, and yet he weaves it all together quite amazingly. I mean, I think he's just an awesome achievement. He's the master in my book, and his descriptions are so wonderful as well. I mean, anybody who's read this will remember the first page and a half, which describes the fog on the Thames in November, and it's just kind of the way it kind of creeps in and out of the houses and across the river, and obviously it's a metaphor for the law, for the impenetrability of the law system at that time. And it's also very famous because there's this very famous moment in it when a character called Crook, who's a second-hand dealer, he suffers what's called spontaneous human combustion. So that he catches fire from within his own body and burns to a crisp. So I think that's probably a dire lesson for anybody who enjoys their gin too much.
Yeah, definitely. So, as you say, for that to have been split up into so many episodes and to keep people wanting to go out and buy it, particularly in those days in the 1850s, must have been so difficult, and as you say, keep track of all the characters. Now, I noticed behind you've got a very intricate board. Is that your plotting board for your book? Are you plan?
This one, it's just like a crib board. So because it was set in Oxford, I went to do my research in Oxford I went 3 times, and so I took photos of all the key locations in Oxford, and obviously detailed maps of Oxford. And when I kind of think of something that I really need to kind of focus on as I'm writing, I kind of jot it down on the board as well. I just keep that. Unfortunately, we had my son's puppy come to stay last week, and he chewed most of the corner off.
Oops.
And that one over there, just over my left-hand shoulder. That's a huge map of Amsterdam.
Oh, it's a map. I thought it was all sort of sections that you filled in.
That's a map of Amsterdam, because there are 9 murders in the next book, and they all take place in very specific locations. for a reason. But there's also a picture of a very rare tulip that nobody's seen for 400 years called the Semper Augustus, and there's a sketch by Rembrandt of a woman, a young woman that was executed by the authorities in Amsterdam, and they all play a part in the plot as well. So that's my evolving crib board for the next book.
Super. So do you tend to do all your research and then sort of start writing and sort of start at page 1 and go on till the end, or do you
I do my research and site visits, and then I sit down and write a chapter by chapter outline of the plot. Literally only about half a side of A4 about what happens in each chapter. And then I sit down to actually write it from page 1, following that chapter by chapter outline, with all my reference material and research material around me. But I think you have to be really careful not to crowd out the possibility of your imagination taking over during it. And if you get suddenly a really great idea halfway through and it screws up, your chapter by chapter outline, then just, go with it, trust yourself.
Do the characters take over as well? Do they give you different avenues to go down?
Yeah, I think the more that you get to know characters, and obviously I now know Jack and Nina. I think I know Jack and Nina very well, and I still want them to do things that will surprise me and surprise the reader. So particularly in Oxford Blues, their relationship goes through quite a bumpy period in Oxford Blues, which hopefully the reader doesn't see coming. So that makes it a lot more interesting as well, I think.
Right.
So yeah, I think Val McDermid was right. She said that in crime fiction, you have to worry about plot, setting, and character almost equally. But in the end, it's the characters that will make people want to read the next book and the next book and the next book, rather than so much the setting and the plot. Yeah.
Great words. Yeah, good advice. So that's so we had Bleak House as number 5. So what's number 6 going to be?
Okay, book 6 is another classic, but I don't apologise for it. It's by Evelyn Waugh, and it's called Scoop. And I think Scoop is a novel that every journalist needs to read at some stage in their lives. It's the best and funniest novel about journalism that's ever been written. And I think we're still waiting for something to come along which transcends it. And it tells the story of a guy called William Boot, who is living in genteel poverty, and he's contributing the occasional nature column for a national daily newspaper, which is called the Daily Beast. And that's the Daily Beast, and that's owned and run by this fearsome character called Lord Copper. But then there's this wonderful case of mistaken identity, and Boot is summoned to London, and they think he's somebody who he isn't, but he's sent off to cover a war in East Africa as the paper's foreign correspondent, and he really doesn't have a clue what he's doing. He's completely inept, complete fish out of water. But of course, he stumbles across the scoop of the story, and then he returns home and he returns to obscurity. But he has these amazingly funny adventures along the way. And obviously, it's a satire, and it was written in 1938. So just before the start of the Second World War. But I think it's still very, very funny. And I think that's because the British tabloid press, who it satirizes, they haven't changed that much. They're still recognizable. They're just as callous and vulgar and shocking as they ever were. And so that's why this book still works. And Waugh himself, was a foreign correspondent for the Daily Mail, and he was sent out to Abyssinia when to report on the Italian on Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia. So he sort of knew what he was writing about. And was able to satirize it so well in Scoop. So I don't like all of his books, but I think Scoop is definitely up there.
Yeah, because you've got that connection again, haven't you? Which is great. That's an interesting book. So we're getting the suitcase is getting quite full now. So we're on to your
big books in this suitcase.
Yeah. So we're on to your final book. So what is your final book going to be?
Okay, my final book is called A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. And believe it or not, I've searched high and low on my bookshelves for this book and I can't find it. So I've obviously lent it out to someone and I've now got to kind of try and remember who it was. I mean, it's the most recent book out of all of my 7. It came out in 2016. Right. And it's the second book by this guy, Amor Towles. And it tells the story of this elegant aristocrat who's called Count Alexander Rostov. And he's sentenced to indefinite house arrest by the Bolsheviks in the Kremlin. But he's sentenced to this house arrest in this 5-star hotel called the Hotel Metropole. And when I first heard the premise of this book, I thought, oh God, it's, how is he going to make it? He's just stuck in a hotel for a whole novel. How's that going to be interesting? It sounds a bit like Waiting for Godot or something.
Yeah.
But, actually, I was captivated by the main character himself. And the story is how he befriends a glamorous actress and a cantankerous chef and a very serious child. And in doing so, he discovers a new pleasures and new purpose in life, which doesn't have anything to do with the trappings of wealth. And I just think it's an utterly charming and intelligent and beautifully written book. It's really elegant. It was on the New York Times bestseller list as a hardback for over a year. And so when I read it, I thought, oh, I'd never heard of this guy before. And I discovered he'd written one book previously. And that turned out to be, oh God, what was it called? It was called The Rules of Civility. And it was about 2 young women arriving in New York for the first time between the wars. Very, very different style of book, but equally really well written. I mean, I think he's a great, great writer. And then I discovered that, a bit like me, he went to university and he studied English, but then he went off and he didn't do any writing for the next 20 years. He became an investment banker, actually, in New York. And then he started to write novels a bit like me, quite late in life. So that sort of gives me a bit of hope, writers like Mary Wesley, who started writing in her 80s.
Yeah.
And that wonderful quote you gave at the start by Thoreau, how vain it is to sit down and write until you've stood up to live. And it doesn't mean you can't be a fantastic young writer, but it does mean, I think, that you should never give up hope if that's what you want to do. And actually, there's something about drawing on your whole life experience that can be an asset for your fiction as well. So Amor Towles and Gentleman in Moscow.
Great, so that's wonderful. And as you say, wise words, because no matter what age you are, you can always write. So so that's great. So altogether, a great selection of 7 books that will keep you busy for a while on the island, I would imagine. So next we look at some of the other bits and pieces you're allowed to take. Now, we believe on Grapevine that there's about 1 hour a day of electricity on the island. And there is a CD and DVD player on. So you're allowed to take 1 CD. Now that could be music, it could be like an audiobook recording or whatever you make, or your own playlist that you put on. So what would you take as a CD?
Okay, well, this one can be short and sharp. It's Ella Fitzgerald, and CD is called Forever Ella, and it's the ultimate collection of Ella Fitzgerald songs. And there's songs like Crimea River, I Get a Kick Out of You, Let's Do It, They Can't Take It Away From Me. And there's even, my favorite track on this CD is her singing Summertime with Louis Armstrong. So I think she's just the best voice ever, female voice ever, perfect tone, pitch, phrasing, and we love her so much that we called our daughter Ella after her.
Ah, lovely.
So I would take that. That would
definitely, and it would remind you of your daughter as well. So that's great, and it'll chill you out listening to that on the island. So next we've got a DVD. Now this can be a film, it can be concert recording, it can be a TV series. So what would you take on DVD?
Okay, so I've sort of cheated a bit with this one, Joe, because if I was allowed to take these books and they would be one book, then I would take them. But there's about 21 books here, so I thought you'd probably ban that idea. But they are it's the complete edition of the Aubrey Maturin novels by Patrick O'Brian. So set in the Napoleonic War. They follow the career of Jack Aubrey, who's this swashbuckling Navy captain, and his friend, who is actually a spy but a surgeon as well, called Stephen Maturin. And I come back and reread this whole set probably once every 3 or 4 years. But I didn't think you'd let me take 21.
Nice sneaky move, though. I won't take a DVD, but I'll take this box.
I think that would have been probably, pulling a fast one, really. So instead of that, I've got the DVD. It's called Master and Commander. It stars Russell Crowe and Paul Bettany, and it's directed by Peter Weir. And it's based on two and a half of the books that I've just shown you. Right. But it's beautifully realised, and it's very faithful, really well acted. So it's probably my favourite DVD film, because it's based on the books that I love so much. I was really pleased the other day, and I put it out on Twitter to discover that they're currently filming a prequel to this. Right. So I think that will go down very well. Patrick O'Brian fans when it comes out.
Great, good choice, and it'll keep you happy, watching a film there. So that's good. So next is a food. Now, because obviously it's imaginary island, it can be a bit more lavish. You might have a never-ending meal, or an ingredient that just keeps recurring. So what would you take as a food item?
Well, I suppose it's quite appropriate for being on an island, but I would take a massive platter of fruits de mer. I would have a pyramid of seafood on a bed of ice. I'd have big succulent garlic prawns, oysters with just a squeeze of lemon, whelks, clams, crab meat, lobster claws. It would be huge, great steel pyramid on some ice of seafood like that, shellfish, and I'd probably need a very cold bottle of Muscadet to go with it. I would have thought.
Definitely. Yeah, and you might catch some some on the island as well. Who knows? So that's great, and as I said, that would be like a recurring one, so it just never ends. So finally, we've got your luxury item, and again, you've got quite a bit of scope with what you want to take on this one. So what would you take as your luxury item?
Okay, well, I've had a long thought about this. I think this is the hardest one, and I don't, as you touched on at the start, I really don't have many regrets in life. I've been incredibly lucky in my marriage, my children, my job, and now, with my writing. But I think if I was pushed into a corner, the one remaining regret that is quite high up there is that I gave up on learning a musical instrument. So I was 12 or 13 at that boarding school, and I was learning the clarinet, and then I went off and joined the choir instead or something. So if I had the time on an island, I'd try to address that, and I'd ask if I could take a clarinet and some books that would teach me how to play.
More books.
And I don't want to stay on this island forever, but I'd like to stay long enough to be able to play the Mozart clarinet concerto by the time I'm rescued, if I could.
There's a challenge.
A clarinet with lots of reeds, I think.
Yeah, but that's great. It's something a little bit different, but something that's special to you and means something to you. So that's great. Now, I must just say that we were expecting to have a guest today, Debbie, but unfortunately, Debbie has been unable to make it. Now, Debbie's a senior editor at your publishers, Orson's Publishing. So I just wanted to sort of say hello to Debbie and hope everything is okay. So just before we finish, Andy, do you want to just remind us of the books you've got out and what's in the pipeline and where people can get them and where they can contact you, etc.?
Yep, sure. Thanks, Joe. So there's the debut book, Canal Pushers,
Just hold them up a little bit more, Andy, but that's it. That's great.
There, River Rats, which is book number 2, and then book number 3, which has just come out, is called Oxford Blues. And hopefully they'll be joined by book 4 next year, which has a working title at the moment, of the Tulip Murders, but that may change, who knows. And they're all available in ebook form or in hardback. And Canal Pushers, the first book, is available in paperback. You know, obviously you can go into your local bookshop, and if they haven't got it in stock, ask them to order it for you. Or they're available from all of the online booksellers, you know, Amazon and Waterstones and all of the rest. So it should be relatively easy to get hold of. And so far, touch wood, the reviews are very good. And you know, really encouraging when you kind of get face to face with readers at book clubs and so on, and they've read them and they, you know, tell you exactly what they think. So yeah, I hope if anybody's inspired to give them a go as a result of this. You don't have to own a narrowboat to enjoy them, but you know, especially if you've never had anything to do with narrowboats, I think you might find that whole world quite interesting. Yeah,
because it's one of them where a lot of people don't realise what goes on, but quite a lot goes on the canals, and you probably think, oh, you know, it's just like people on holiday or whatever, or day trippers, but with a lot goes on.
Yeah, so, a lot of people out there on them now. You know, more people on the canals in the UK now than there were at the height of the 18th century. You know, the height of the canal network being used. So a lot of people are living on them now because they can't afford houses. There's a whole new world out there, which is kind of really interesting.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, Andy. Just one final question: what are you currently reading?
What am I currently reading? Oh gosh, I can't remember the name of
it. Put you on the spot though, because it's just a question that came up.
What is it? It's next door. I can't even tell you, but it's one of 3 crime novels, and it's set in New York just after the Second World War. And the first one was set in New Orleans, and the second one was set in Chicago with Al Capone. So it's that whole kind of gangster scene. So it's more crime, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
But you know, if you write it, you gotta read it as well.
You have. That's great. Well, as I say, apologies for putting you on the spot there. But, so just to let everybody know that next week on the 19th, we've got Sean Campbell. On the 26th of August, we've got Lorraine Turnbull. And on the 2nd of September, we've got Jane Buckley. So that's events that are coming up in the coming weeks. But many thanks for coming, Andy. Really enjoyed talking to you this evening and finding out what you'd take to the island. Have a good time on the island and hope you can get rescued. Thank you very much, Andy Griffee.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.